the guitar. Uh, so the first question I have for you is, how did that kind of come into play? Because you kind of hold the guitar more upright than most guitar
Yeah,
players.
I can demonstrate for your viewers. We don't have to play anything. I can share my position. So most folks hold the guitar like this. And probably in the 70s, I started angling the neck up a little bit because I have relatively small hands. And I found when I got interested in some pianistic voicings that involve some stretching, it's much easier on your left hand if the neck is up at this angle. And you see some classical players doing this too. So
Mm.
it's essentially facilitating some of these reaches. That's why I hold it this way. And it's actually, I remember at some point in the 90s, it was almost completely vertical. So I brought it down a little over the years, but it still feels more natural, more comfortable for me. I also tell guitar players who are interested in more pianistic voicings that involve stretching your hand, you learn how to use the sides as well as the tips of your fingers on your left hand. So that allows you to make some of these stretches and reaches. I'm certainly not the only person that uses some of these voicings, but I found that to train your hands to play these stretches, I also have low action and light strings. This helps the neck at that angle, and learning how to use a little more of the pad of your finger. All those things kind of enable you to play some of these voicings to sound more pianistic on the guitar, basically.
Okay. Did you find that it changed a little bit of your technique, changing the angle of the neck like that?
Not so much technique, just facilitating those voicings. So in that sense, yes, it kind of expanded my harmonic palette a bit, Joe, just because I could grab some of these chords. I mean, other guitar players who think pianistically are people like Ted Green, Jimmy Weibel, Sid Jacobs, who studied with Jimmy, who's written a number of great books. So a lot of these folks are using pianistic sounds, Gene Bertoncini, a lot of inner
Mm.
voice movement. And I think many guitar players who are great soloists choose to focus more on single lines and developing their solo playing from a single line standpoint as opposed to chords. And especially if you're in the more intimate settings of solos and duos and maybe trios, there's a whole other universe of beautiful, more detailed harmonic information that you can play with some of these chord shapes that I love. And then so that becomes part of your approach to playing. It's not just single lines or chords, it can be both kind of mixed together, especially if you're playing alone or in duo.
Right. I think that leads perfectly into another question. You know, when I hear you play, you're not always playing in one particular situation, being as you're just in a group. I hear you very often as a solo player. I hear you very
Mm-hmm.
often as a duo player and as a group player. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so let's maybe talk about solo guitar first, and
Okay.
because that kind of ties in with you holding the guitar more upright to get these different chord voicings. How do you start to approach being a solo guitar player?
Well, I would encourage every guitarist who has any inclination to do so to pursue solo guitar for a couple of reasons. Number one, when you get good enough at doing it, it's very enjoyable to be able to play alone and know that you can hold an audience's attention. But in the beginning, before we have a strategy, I think the first step, assuming you're interested to learn this, is just to listen to some great solo guitarists to have some frames of reference. So some great straight ahead players, people like Joe Pass, Martin Taylor, Tuck Andrus. When Patty stopped singing, it essentially becomes solo guitar with the Tuck and Patty duo they've had now for probably 40 years. Those are all great musicians. Older generation, Bucky Pizzarelli could play beautiful solo. Jimmy Weibel, who's probably one of my very favorites because of all the beautiful harmonic detail that he created. Johnny Smith could play well alone. I'm trying to think of other people from that generation. Barney Kessel played well alone.
Yeah.
So there's thankfully plenty of footage available on YouTube of all of these great players. And in terms of wading into those waters yourself as a guitarist, I think a good place to start is to learn some chord melody arrangements from somebody else. And two guitar players who are good references for that are Joe Pass and Wes Montgomery. Because although Wes was not really known as a solo player, he absolutely could. And a lot of Joe's career for probably the last 10, 15 years of his life was playing solo.
Mm.
And what they both could do very well was take relatively simple individual chord fingerings. They were not necessarily thinking in a pianistic way on the guitar. So the individual fingerings, if you look at them, are pretty simple, as you probably know, Joe. But they put them in, they took those relatively simple fingerings and used them in really nice arrangements. So I think you can still probably get the Joe Pass chord solos book from the 70s. And it's got
Mm.
tunes like Misty and the Blues and Summertime. They're not difficult tunes. But what you're getting when you look at that is voice leading, and the ability to transition back and forth between chords and single notes in the arrangement, which is a skill that also then can be translated into the improvisational part of a tune. You have that skill that you develop playing chord melodies of being able to transition back and forth between chords and lines. And that skill also comes in very handy when you want to improvise over a tune to be able to make those transitions smoothly. So I tell guitarists initially start out, and maybe you have similar advice for your students who are interested in exploring solo playing. Start out by learning some chord melodies from somebody else, anybody else. It could be Joe Pass, Wes Montgomery. There are many, many other great players who have solo guitar arrangements. I suspect Martin Taylor probably has some written material, and Martin is also a great straight ahead player.
Incredible
So,
player.
yeah, now maybe it takes you, maybe you're just beginning and it feels so intimidating because that first arrangement that you learn might take you a month to learn. But I would argue that the process does begin to speed up. You become more efficient at learning fingerings. You begin to get a sense of voice leading. You begin to then use some of those chords that you're learning in that specific arrangement, and you can apply them more broadly to other tunes, to comping, to soloing. Those chord shapes can exist as templates on the neck for developing single lines, as you and I have said in some of our sessions together.
Right.
So the process does become more efficient. You get faster learning them. And then once you've learned, say, 7 or 8 or 10 of these things from whoever, I would suggest maybe multiple sources, then you have enough of a strategy in terms of creating chord melodies by looking at someone else's. You have enough of a developed chord vocabulary. You have enough of a sense of how voice leading works to then start to do your own chord melodies. So you take a look at a chart, a song that you know already, but perhaps that you don't have a chord melody worked up for, and you make quick decisions based on the density of the melody, where the chords can be factored into that arrangement and where you can play single notes. So chord melody typically is a mixture, unless it's a ballad, typically a mixture of single notes and chords together. So your strategy just involves looking at that melody and seeing where it's realistic to play chords versus single notes. And then you create your own arrangement. And after a while, you've got maybe an hour of material. Maybe this takes you 6 months to get an hour of material. And then your next step, what I would suggest, is creating informal opportunities for yourself to play alone for others. And initially, that can be something as simple as bringing your guitar to a gathering of friends and offering to play a few songs. And of course, your friends are going to say, yes, we'd love to hear you. And that will absolutely feel different playing for 3 or 4 friends listening than it would be for you practicing very diligently at home. You're creating an audience for yourself. Maybe you're just playing for 10 minutes, but you're getting this notion of playing something alone for people. And maybe initially it's just playing the arrangements of the chord melodies. Maybe you're not quite confident enough to play alone for others. Another thing I'd certainly recommend in terms of gauging your progress is taping yourself. And then listen to it a week later, see how those arrangements sound. Is the melody clearly articulated? If you're playing it in time, does it feel like the pulse is clear? You can also be working out rubato arrangements. A lot of my solo playing sort of has different versions of how I play melodies. So if it has too much harmonic detail for me to play in time, I might have a more complex version of the melody, rubato. And then I might have a simple arrangement if I'm playing the same melody in time, where I'm playing less chords or less harmonic detail. So when I started out doing this, Joe, I was playing in little coffee shops. So I still sometimes play little background gigs. I have friends with art galleries and restaurants, and I'll park myself in the corner. And hopefully some folks are listening, but in some cases, maybe folks are there just for a meal and a glass of wine when we're all able to gather indoors again. I'm doing some outdoor gigs now, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So basically putting yourself in situations where there's little or no pressure to perform, but people are there with you. So again, it feels more like a performance than it would if you're working on the same arrangements at home. And over time, you develop confidence, you develop repertoire, you have a sense of how to present yourself in solo, and then you can work your way up to perhaps solo little house concerts, which I do actually enjoy. I still do them. You're playing in someone's living room, and maybe it's 5 people on the couch, but if you're lucky, maybe it's 20 or 30 people, in which cases, in some cases, you can make some real money doing this. But the goal is not money. The goal is about having a nice intimate performance with your friends. So that setting is ideal for solo guitar. So I've been now doing this probably for 40 plus years playing alone, and it's still not nearly as good as I'd like it to be, but it is better than when I started, for sure. And people like Ted Green, Jimmy Weibel, Gene Burton CD are all sources of inspiration, although I haven't copied any of them. There's some great younger players who play beautifully alone, like Julie Lage, Lage Lund, Gilad Hexelman, Mike Moreno, Jotam Silverstein. These are some of the younger folks that I know of. And some of these, I'm sure there's some guys younger than them that I haven't heard about yet that I'll keep an eye open for. So I'm not trying to copy anybody, but I try to be aware of what other folks are doing. And so my solo playing just started playing at these little very informal coffee houses and small background gigs. And I slowly developed my skills doing this. And I would urge every guitar player to do it because you're not only increasing your vocabulary and how the guitar can work as a little mini orchestra, but there are lots of opportunities for work, and hopefully there will be again, in situations where there's only physical space and the budget for a single musician. So like pretty much us or a piano player. This could be a restaurant, an art gallery, a corporate event, a private party, a house concert. And so these are not really open to groups, but they're open to solo musicians. So I would encourage everybody who's at all interested, first listen to be aware of what you can do on the guitar from the great players who preceded us, and then start with a couple of simple chord melody arrangements to begin to get involved in the process. And I'm very happy that I did over the years. I don't always like what I sound like when I play, don't believe me, but I like it well enough that I think it's okay. You know, I've got a number of solo CDs now and lots of videos, and you know, over the years, if I added up all the solo gigs, it's a little chunk of income for sure.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, those solo gigs, you know, I remember my first one, it was the most terrifying thing ever.
Yeah. And now I'm sure you're more comfortable.
I'm much more comfortable, and you know, it's about time too. You know, for me, that first solo gig, part of why I took it was because it was only about 45 minutes. You know, the entire thing was an hour, but there was only 45 minutes of playing. So that relaxed me a whole bunch, that I didn't need a ton of material. But now, as I've grown as a musician, I can play much, much longer gigs, and they are very, very rewarding. You know,
I agree.
It's kind of like a battle for me because it's the thing I'm most scared of. And it's like, oh man, I made it through that.
But like anything else, the more you do something, the better you get at it. And you also get comfortable with presenting your repertoire to an audience. And you get a sense of how you want to essentially feel on stage playing alone. All those things, anything obviously with practice improves. And this is something that we can do. And I'm very happy that we're both able to do it. And I would encourage any guitar player who's interested to do it. And some of the skills that you acquire playing alone also translate well into group settings, as we mentioned.
Right.
Certainly chord melodies, if you are the only chordal instrument in a setting, to be able to transition smoothly back and forth between chords and single lines in your solos, as I mentioned, is a direct extension of your ability to play chord melody. So there's so many benefits to it. I'd highly recommend everybody investigate it.
Right. And another benefit of that is, I think, and you're definitely someone that's very strong with this, is holding your own time while you're playing solo guitar. That's one thing that I really noticed in your solo playing. I know you do have some rubato stuff, but when you're playing in time for yourself, you are truly playing in time for yourself.
Oh, thanks.
What are some ways that you kind of approach just learning to stay in time when you are the only performer?
Well, some folks say that there are some benefits to putting a metronome on initially to develop good internal pulse. You could play it with quarter notes or have the click be 2 and 4. Some people try 1 and 3 even, or they'll try a really slow quarter note and try to hold it to just develop good internal time. There's a lot of space between the beats. And then they'll turn the metronome off and turn it back on again and see if they're kind of locked in where they should be. You know, when we're playing with other musicians, typically, we're not trying to play like we're playing with a metronome. Typically, I think in my case and many other folks too, the time tends to speed up a little bit because of the natural adrenaline of playing in the moment together. And as long as the tempo's not out of control at the outcourse of the melody, I don't mind a little rushing, quite honestly. And occasionally on some studio projects, I've done one recently with my friend Dan Dean, who's a great vocalist and bassist. We did a project that had multiple overdubs of voices and guitars and basses. So we needed to use a click. And very often I just find myself feeling kind of held back by the click. Like I had to really kind of slow down to accommodate the click, but it's essentially me wanting to rush a little. The click is not slowing down, obviously. So I can do that if I have to. Typically, I think if I'm playing alone without a click, if I'm playing solo, not a recording, but just a gig, I tend to be a little on top of the time. So I'm hearing myself kind of like the ride cymbal with a little bit of an edge to it, like a Jack DeJohnette, or for thinking bass, someone like Eddie Gomez or Dave Hollander. I'd like to be a little on top of the quarter. That for me just kind of feels like it moves the time forward, and someone else might interpret that as rushing. But that's kind of the way I feel and the way I hear it, especially duo or solo settings. And another thing I love to do sometimes, you'd assuming playing alone, I'll demonstrate this at the end of our interview if you like with my guitar. You'd assume you'd have to fill up all the space, and same with playing a swing tune, you want to have a kind of a strong walking bass, which is something that it is nice to be able to do. Joe Pass did that beautifully. I think you do it well too.
Right.
But I think it's also some fun to imply the time. So you can play something and let a fair amount of space go by, a beat or two, and then come back in a way that's very deliberate, wherever you choose to come back in. Could be an upbeat or down, but it doesn't matter. But I think it's fun sometimes to imply the time without actually stating it, even if you're playing alone. And I think if you do it correctly, the audience can feel the pulse with you. I mean, maybe you'd think you'd have to go ba-doom, ba-doom, boom, but I love going doom, Gadi, Gadi. And if that's really all I'm playing, if I do it correctly, you're still going to feel that quarter note in field 2 and 4. So again, it's very kind of a very deliberate sense of using the space to shape the phrases. And of course, we do that playing with other musicians. It's a bit more of a challenge doing it alone, but it is possible. This is another situation where it can be very useful to tape yourself. And if you're trying to play some things that are over the bar or a little more complex rhythmically, in ways that imply the time as opposed to stating it, tape yourself and then see if you can really feel the 2 and 4 when you listen to it after the fact. And I don't always succeed with this. Sometimes I'm here and I think, that pulse could be it's a little vague in here. I'm kind of losing it. So I'm losing it. Clearly everybody else is too, since I'm listening to myself. So I'm still trying to fine tune my rhythmic strategies. But I think, the metronome can help. Whatever my rhythmic vocabulary is, kind of developed by osmosis. So I'd have a hard time writing down a lot of what I'm playing. I could probably sit there and count it all out and eventually write it down, but I'm not thinking eighth note triplet tied to a dotted quarter. I'm just playing something. And all those rhythmic devices, all of my rhythmic vocabulary just happened by osmosis, just by listening to the people who had a very finely developed sense of rhythm. And in some cases, some of those folks are probably great side readers. I am not. So I would argue that some parts of music can kind of come into your playing almost as if by magic. Just because you listen to something over and over again, you learn how to internalize it. So I remember tapping my foot to some jazz records and just trying to keep my place in the tune, and recognizing after a while that I could do it, but just based on the fact that I knew the song or I heard a solo or a particular phrase over and over again, I could begin to feel the pulse and feel where the subdivisions were. And so those phrases, without necessarily having to be written down, then became a part of my rhythmic vocabulary.
Right, I agree. And it's kind of just the same with the normal notes of vocabulary too. The more you hear it and get used to it, the more you kind of draw into that sound. They start to sneak into your brain as you're playing.
I think that's right. I mean, just listening to great musicians, even if you don't know exactly the technical basis for everything you're listening to, I think is extremely useful. You're just listening to great music, and it doesn't have to be even any one style. Someone told me something funny once about some of my tunes. He said, "Boy, I really hear that Leo Brouwer influence." And I said, "Wow." And Leo Brouwer, I know a little of his music. He's an incredible Cuban guitarist and composer.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just heard little tiny fragments of his music, and it's definitely very jazz influenced. And there's some incredible musicians coming out of Cuba. I'm in touch with some friends down there now, actually. I'm going to try to get down there at some point. There's some wonderful musicians there now. I'm sure some great younger players. My friend Hector is a wonderful guitarist. Fedietta, he's wonderful. We're going to try to do some work together. But boy, I sure didn't transcribe any Leo Brouwer or learn any of his music. So somehow we just had some common language. I know he also likes jazz, so that might be the common bond. But the little bit of Leo Brouwer that I listened to, could some of that possibly have snuck into my playing? It's possible. It's kind of a stretch, but the little bit of Brouwer I've heard, I can hear that maybe some of that language somehow, we maybe both had that common influence somehow in jazz. But you never know where something that you're listening to can somehow come into your playing. So I've just encouraged people just to seek out and listen to great music all the time. And there are some benefits there for sure, even if they don't happen in a tangible way right away.
Yeah, I totally agree that just listening to music in kind of a different way, I feel like there's just listening to music for its enjoyment, which I think is still very, very important, because you don't want to burn yourself out. But there is, listening to the intent of learning, what is happening in the music right now? What can I pick out of this? Why do I like this? Why does this music work? I think are all very important things for everybody, not just students, to, do as well as just listening for enjoyment.
I agree. And you may not even know that you're putting a set of musical values in place, because you may not know what you like until you hear something. I mean, some people maybe grow on you and you don't like them so much in the beginning, and then over time you realize, boy, there's some things about this musician I really like. And then what is it that I like? So maybe you get a little more analytical about what is it that moves you when you hear that person play. And so that ultimately might help you assemble a set of musical values for you, not only as a listener, but as a player. What are some things that are important to you to hear? And what are some things that are important to you to hear in your own playing? What are some things that are important for you to hear when you converse with other musicians? What to you makes the group dynamic and the group conversation interesting? So these are all things that can be changing and kind of fluid based on who you are playing with. So I modify my playing, and I think that to me is a challenge that I enjoy. I mean, maybe I decide not to play something to serve a particular musical conversation with someone that I'm playing with. that to me is not a bad compromise. That's what all the studying is for, to allow us to interact in a meaningful way and kind of validate each other's choices without trying to copy each other. So my goal with whoever I'm playing with is just to make that feel like a great, relaxed, fun conversation. And this is also obviously fun for the audience to hear us interacting and playing and inspiring each other. So that's really what all the study is for. We ultimately hopefully forget most of the technique, and we just have this vocabulary that's available to us in kind of an intuitive, creative, spontaneous way that we can then draw on, not only when we're playing alone, but also using that information to quickly kind of assess how someone else thinks about the music, how they play, how they think about harmony, rhythm, melody. And then how can I use whatever I've learned and quickly assess what that other person or those other people are doing so that we can somehow meet and have a conversation. And that, I love that challenge. I'm
Yeah.
sure you do too.
Yeah. I kind of feel like you're starting to talk a little bit about duo playing, which is one of my favorite ways of playing music. I love just being with another person. Sometimes that's the most fun that I can have on a gig, as just as a duo. And you're very well versed with that. You do a lot of duo gigs with singers. I saw you just did was it a Facebook Live with a singer here recently?
Yeah, a friend of mine named Anandi Geffro, who's a very good singer here in Portland, Oregon, where I live, and her dad is a Latin percussionist. I've known both of them casually for years, and Anandi and I have become a little better friends in the last 3 or 4 years and done a bunch of gigs together, primarily locally here in the Northwest, Washington and Oregon only. And her boyfriend's a great flutist saxophonist, so sometimes he'll come and join us too. But she's very intuitive, and she has great time, so I don't necessarily need to worry if I'm going to play something that's a little bit extended harmonically or rhythmically. She has a very clearly developed sense of pulse, and we've now played enough together and have enough musical history that we really have fun together. And we're doing primarily mainstream repertoire, but she's also willing to learn new material, and she improvises beautifully, has a great sound. So I've been very fortunate to play with some terrific singers. She's the singer I've been playing the most with lately. I have another long-standing relationship with an old friend who I met in Seattle about 25 years ago named Kendra Shank, who's been in New York now for about 20 years. And we've stayed in touch and done some recordings and touring together on the East and West Coast. And she's wonderful too. And she's actually been willing to learn a few of my tunes, in a couple of cases setting lyrics to them. And she's different than Anandi, less kind of conventionally jazz oriented because she started as a folk singer, but then got interested in jazz. So surrounded herself with great jazz players. So her voice has the kind of the timbre and quality almost of a folk singer, a pure kind of airy high soprano. But she's learned how to create sort of an ability to improvise too, not using the conventional bebop vocabulary, but just using her ability to create beautiful melodies. And when she got to New York, found some really terrific musicians to play with and assembled a working trio with Frank Kimbrough, who's a terrific piano player, Dean Johnson, stellar bass player who's originally from the Northwest, and different drummers and percussionists, Matt Wilson, Tony Marino. And she's done a number of recordings where she's added guitar, saxophone. So she has a discography and has done some touring over the years in Asia, Europe, East and West Coast, and we're still in contact. And our last little tour was probably about 1.5 years ago. But when I'm in New York, I let her know, and she has a long-standing last Friday gig at the the 55 bar where Mike Stern plays in the Village. So I've done that with her many times over the years, and she's wonderful. And one other thing I'd recommend that people check out if they don't know her, she's now sort of retired from touring, but I bet still singing great, is Nancy King. She's also in Portland where I live. And she's recorded over the years with Ray Brown, Fred Hirsch, and others, and done some of her own recordings. And just an incredible natural singer. She can't find middle C on the piano, but if you just play her a line or play some chords, she can scat through it fearlessly. She knows a million tunes. She's a perfect improviser. And she's wonderful. So those are 3, but I've worked with many other great ones too.
Nice. Yeah.
And working with the wonderful singers, is a beautiful, intimate conversation.
Yeah, it's a lot different. I don't get to do it as often, but it is way different from just working with a bass player or a saxophonist. There's just something else that is added. It's maybe more intimate for the audience because they can actually hear words and everything. Yes. So there's a different connection that I feel. But continuing with that, how different is it for you to prepare for a duo versus a singer, sax, or just a bass player? Because I know you've worked with David Friesen. You've also worked with David Liebman on some duo albums.
Yeah. Well, every duo situation is different. Now with bass, certain voicings would not work as well as a duo with, say, saxophone or voice. So if I'm playing some close intervals on the low strings, below the fifth fret, I probably would not use those voicings with the bass player unless the bass is way up high. So part of what you do is think a little bit about the context. So I've had some great, along with David, I've worked with many other great bass players. Don Thompson, I've done a few gigs with in Toronto, who's a stellar bass player, who worked with Jim Hall and George Shearing. We've done a few gigs over the years and one recording up in Banff that Dave Liebman is on, actually. So, you kind of fine tune your strategies and how you approach just based on that particular person, and different musicians on the same instrument also obviously create slightly different approaches. Mm-hmm. So my approach with Kendra Shank might be different from my approach with an Andy or Nancy King. Again, sort of fine tuning based on someone's approach to time, how much of the pulse they actually need to hear to feel comfortable, how much dissonance versus consonance they use. So these are all things you take into account when you're playing with a different duo partner. And I agree with you that the one-on-one conversation in duo is such a beautiful, intimate setting. I've done a lot of duo guitar things too, probably a dozen or more duo guitar CDs, and I have guitar player friends all over the world I've played in duo with. And guitar duo is also an interesting conversation because we can also trade information about voicing, voice leading. We need to be able to leave enough space for each other, so that's critical. So Jim Hall and other guitar players that I respect said something that stuck with me, which is listen to singers and horn players to learn how to breathe on the guitar and leave enough space, especially in duo with another guitar. That's critical.
So you're kind of going off that with maybe chord and line vocabulary, since you have a very, very vast chord knowledge. And if you haven't seen any of John's articles, I would definitely check those out. He's also got a chord melody book. Is it through Melbay?
I've got a bunch of things that cover chords. So Melbay was my first book CD, but I also got material that extensively covers chords, 3 courses with Surefire, which is a great resource. I've got 2 more courses coming out with them later this year. DC Music, Dennis Jang, I have 3 volumes with him. And then individual lessons on Mike Geller's Mike's Masterclasses, where you can buy individual lessons, and you can see excerpts of all of these things up on my YouTube channel. And, probably every guitar player now has free samples of some of their teaching content. Maybe you do too, so that you can kind of introduce people to how you teach and your approach to harmony.
And all of this will be down in the link or the description box below. But how did you kind of start memorizing chords to where you're using them so freely? Because that's kind of the thing that I see in your playing, where a guitar player kind of has their stock voicings, and then maybe once they'll get kind of this cool voicing in, and that could be intentional, but at least for you, it's like you've got such a large vocabulary that's a little bit different from everybody else's. How did you kind of start getting into that?
Good question. A couple of things you can do. Number one, again, learning chord melodies. Maybe in the beginning, you're learning someone else's chord melodies, as we mentioned earlier. So you may come up with, you may be exposed to, I should say, maybe 10, 15, 20 new fingers you've never played before. But, chord books, which are very good resources from people like Ted Green, Mick Goodrick, and many others, are intimidating because it's pages of individual fingerings. If you're learning a chord melody arrangement, it's easier to retain those new shapes in the context of that melody. So once you then have that all memorized, then maybe start with something relatively simple, like a blues arrangement. One of those Joe Pass chord solos would be perfect for that. Summertime, a tune that that's not very complex harmonically, but with some new voicings. Then you can extract those voicings, as I mentioned, from that context and use them elsewhere. So this is a way, I think, to retain new shapes, not just individual fingerings, although you absolutely can open a chord book and find some new shapes that you like, but I don't try to get more than 3 or 4 at a time because I'll never remember them either. Myself, as long as I've been trying to work out new voicings, I'm not going to remember 15 new fingerings. I'll remember 3 or 4, and then I'll try to use them in the context of a tune. Or all of my songs are chord melodies, not necessarily a chord for every note in the melody, but every one of those is really a chord melody, and I've shared some of those with you. Maybe I'll play one later at the end of our interview. So this is how I retain new shapes in the context of an arrangement. Now, the other strategy that I'll do sometimes is simply take the basic chord shapes that everybody knows and then look at the other notes that are available to me within that chord type. So I know if I want to play a C major 7, I'm sure everybody who's a guitar player watching has a number of basic C major 7s they can play. But if you know that you can add the 6 and the 9, then I'm looking for all the A's and D's in a particular position and seeing how I can add them, in some cases replacing one of the original 4 notes of the basic major 7th chord, the 1, 3, 5, 7, with the 6 or the 9. Then I know that I can add the sharp 11 for Lydian, the sharp 5 for augmented, the sharp 9 for Lydian sharp 9. So then I'm looking for the F sharp, the G sharp, and the D sharp. So those are the notes that I can add to a major chord. Although I actually found something interesting that maybe you and I could talk about another time. It may not be, this may be a little too technical for our interview,
Right.
but there's some interesting versions of major where you can add the sus actually. And I've never seen major sus written before, but as long as you don't put it on top, you and I can share one or two voice things that I picked up recently that French shared from a harmonic major, but you can actually get away with the sus in a major chord, depending on how you voice it. Definitely not on top, but in the middle of the voicing, it can work. So that's kind of a stretch, but I've been experimenting with that a little bit lately. So those are the notes I know that I can add to the basic major chord. So take 10 minutes, start with a familiar fingering, locate those other notes that are available to you, and you will come up with at least one or two new shapes that you will like, I guarantee it.
Right. And another thing that I've heard you say before is a lot of your single note vocabulary just comes from the chord shapes that you've played.
Absolutely. And yours too. Yeah, that chord shape, if you see that on the neck, that can be a little template, as I said earlier, to generate single lines. Just like, I mean, you and I tend to favor, those who haven't heard either one of us, you can check us out online, obviously. You and I both like the wider intervals,
right?
Because that gives us the sound of the chords moving. I wouldn't rule out scales or chromatic harmony for your solos. You can certainly use those as well. But to me, I'm not really hearing the chord if someone just runs up and down a scale. The arpeggio, or maybe a slightly modified arpeggio that adds some extension. So not only 1-3-5-7 is a great place to start. So if we're playing C major, sometimes I really just want to hear C, E, G, B, and nothing else. That's all that's necessary. There's some great melodies like Isfahan or Forest Flower. I can think of a bunch of tunes where someone's just running right up and down a major arpeggio. You can hear so clearly. It's baked into some melodies. It's right there. So the arpeggios generally are what I favor when I solo, and I know you feel the same way, just because the wider intervals, again, give us the sound of the chord. And chord shapes also are introducing some templates on the neck, just like an arpeggio. So I'm seeing a shape, and I'm just extracting individual notes from that shape, either double stops or actual single notes. And it may feel obvious to you because you know the chord shape, but to someone listening, it's not necessarily obvious. They don't know that shape that you're basing your single line idea from necessarily.
Right. It's, kind of going with that, you've got a very unique sound. I think anybody that has listened to you, they can point you out very quickly, like, oh, that's John Stowell. So was that something that has always is kind of been natural to you, or did you start off like a lot of other people where you were picking up things from, Joe Pass, or to where you were learning solos, and so you, for a short period of time, you maybe sounded more like somebody else? Mm-hmm.
Sure. Good question. Part of my approach to being original is luck. Part of it's laziness, and part of it's the work ethic. So I'll explain all that. By the way, for most people, transcribing and copying in the beginning to build vocabulary is a good thing to do, because in the beginning, we don't know how to take a scale or arpeggio and make music. Your teacher says, learn this scale, learn this arpeggio, so you learn them. And you're looking at a set of changes and you say, well, I know I can play something that's harmonically correct, but it doesn't sound creative. So then we need to look at, and I would suggest that guitar players, again, look at singers, horn players, piano players, check out other instruments so your guitar playing is not necessarily so idiomatically tied to our instrument. So just about everybody I know who's original will tell you that as well, that they're influenced by different styles of music in some cases, or certainly different instrumentalists or vocalists, not only people in our instrument. Now, if you're completely in love with one particular guitarist or one particular musician, and your goal is to sound like a really good approximation of them, that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. And people will probably be very happy to hear you do that. That probably the very best they're going to say is, that's a really good copy. They're not going to say, you sound amazing, you have an original voice. Now, if that's your goal, though, that does absolutely take some skill, some discipline, and practice, and it's hard to do well. If you want to sound a lot like Keith Jarrett or Jim Hall, that takes a lot of practice. You're not going to sound better than them playing in this way. But if that's what fulfills you as a musician, and that's your goal, that's actually a pretty noble goal, and that does require a lot of work and dedication. Mm-hmm. If, however, you want to find something original, in the beginning, you don't know what that will be because you haven't found it yet, and you don't have anyone else as a reference. So when I started, I studied. I had the benefit when I was growing up in Connecticut of having two men as teachers, one of whom was a guitarist, one of whom was a pianist. And they were both supportive, very nice. I ended up playing a little bit with both of them. The guitarist was kind of an unsung hero. This is Southern Connecticut where I grew up. He chose to focus primarily on teaching. So he did plenty of small local gigs and some recording, but he really didn't tour per se. His name was Link Chamberlain. And I actually met Dave Liebman through Link. And I don't sound anything like Link. He did a couple of records for Muse, a small label that was around for many years in New York. And he kind of sounds like John McLaughlin, very dense, but he certainly knew harmony. And one of his tenets, one of his sort of important goals as a teacher was to encourage you to try to find your own voice, which is what I've tried to do in my own teaching. And a lot of what Link gave me, I still use. So there's modes of the melodic minor. You and I have talked about his keys. I got that from Link. And so I still love to credit him because he's not as well known as he deserves to be. So I think Link sort of helped me. And basically what he told me was, here's the theory. And he gave me certainly some ideas of his own, but some little voice in my head said, listen, be aware of the tradition, listen to the great players, but don't copy. So that meant I had to try to somehow find my own vocabulary. And that I think came from some of these chord shapes and the wider intervals and just discovering melodies that I liked. And initially, sure, and I've also learned plenty of melodies from other composers just to learn the melody of a song. And I think learning melodies is actually just as important as learning solos or portions of solos, because melodies essentially, to me, improvisation at the highest level, Joe, is creating beautiful melodies. So it's not really about, it's not really about licks. It's about things ultimately that at least some of which should be singable, I think. I mean, I play some things that sound kind of pattern oriented that maybe you couldn't necessarily sing, but I'd say most of the time I try to slow down a little and leave a little space to allow me to deconstruct the memorized patterns and try to find the melodies. And that space, if I'm playing with other musicians, also then encourages more of a conversation. So I'm using the resources of the people that I'm playing with to help me try to find melodies and creative things too. So initially it was formal study with Link and also a pianist named John Mehegan, who was one of the first people actually to write a jazz theory book. And he had taught and been in New York, came up in the 50s. And I met him in the early 1970s when I was studying with Link. And John had a little weekend gig at a restaurant. And I was just good enough that I wouldn't trip him up. And I think he appreciated having someone else to play some solos. So he was playing with the bass player. And I used to go sit in for free. I did it for probably 2 or 3 years. And he would just start a tune. He wouldn't tell me what it was. It was always a standard, typically not a hard one. But I didn't know the tune. So I just sit there and just try to figure out the key centers and play something that wouldn't be totally embarrassing and not trip him up and keep my place. And I got better at it. And he understood that I was new and just learning, but he gave me that opportunity. And so between Link Chamberlain and John Mehegan, I got a pretty good foundation in the harmony, some standard repertoire. And that's when I began to sort of formulate this notion of what I thought I might want to sound like, which actually is still evolving. Probably every musician though that I know that has original voice would tell you that you can't really plan what that's going to be. So your playing just evolves in an organic way, being influenced by other musicians, other styles of music, and having a willingness to try to find your own vocabulary. But it's hard to do because you don't really have any kind of fixed references other than a sort of a general sense of what your musical values are, which also I think can be refined and sort of expanded and fine-tuned as you go along. So I now have a pretty good sense of what my musical values are, although I'm still very much a work in progress. I'd say I probably started to sound original in my late 20s. If you listen to my first record, I don't really sound like anybody even then. So I first started recording in the late 1970s. So at that point, I'd only been playing jazz probably 5, 6, 7 years. I didn't start out playing jazz, but I already sort of sound like myself then, kind of. You might be able to recognize it as me. But I'd say I think I've felt like I've really sort of come into my own musical identity in the last 15, 20 years. But I can tell you for sure, when I listened to myself 15 years ago, I can definitely hear hopefully a bit of improvement and a bit of growth. And I still feel like year to year, there's a bit of refinement and growth going on as long as I've been doing this. And I have friends in their late 80s who are not only still active, but still talking like they really want to develop and feel like they have room for improvement. So, if you have good health and you maintain your health and you have good genetics and you're lucky, you can be making really creative music in your 70s and not into your 80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really the beautiful thing about music is that we can consistently keep growing. And that's where we have some conversations in the past. You've been really excited. Oh, you got to check out this chord voicing that I found.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, what are some ways for people to maybe stay motivated when they're practicing? Because I know that we all have highs and lows. Throughout practice, there'd be days where we're practicing, we feel great, or it could be because the gig went really well. But then there are those periods where like, oh, this is not the right career path for me. Or, or man, I can't hang with these guys. I don't know what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
As being a touring musician for as long as you have, I'm sure you've felt like that. What are some ways that you keep walking forward?
Sure. Well, we all have highs and lows, and I can tell you that even the famous people certainly have their frustrations and disappointments too. So the first thing I think is, how much do I love this craft? I mean, if you like it but are not completely in love with it, it's a wonderful hobby. And there's some very good amateur musicians who decide that for whatever reason, financial obligations or the ups and downs of trying to make a living with this, it's just not a career for them. But they play beautifully, and they still play, and they still have gigs. They might still record. They might hire us because they recognize that we could use some help. So they become our patrons in some cases. So if you can find something else outside of music that you like well enough to do, and you still have enough time and energy left to have a musical life, that's not a bad choice. I have two friends who are relatively recent friends who are both successful bankers, and they do not sound like amateur musicians. They sound like professional musicians. They can absolutely hang with me musically, no problem. And if they didn't tell you they were bankers, you wouldn't know they were bankers. I have another friend who's a lawyer who really sounds, and he studied at Berkeley. He had every intention of being a professional musician, and then some life responsibilities and changes intervened, but he still plays, still does gigs, and he's been an active lawyer for 20 odd years with a nice career. So amateur comes from a Latin word to love. So amateur to me is not a negative word that has any negative connotations at all. So if that ends up being your lot in life, music is a serious hobby or a part-time avocation, fantastic. If you're completely in love with the craft, and everyone will tell you the same thing, ups and downs and everything that goes into music with the disappointments and the rejections. If the love of the craft is still there, music kind of chooses you. Do I need to do music or something else? No, it's so clearly music, even if you have no guarantee of success, no clear career path necessarily even. But if you're just completely in love with the music speaks to you in this way. So and you may decide at some point, maybe I don't love the craft so much anymore. Maybe I need to take a step back and do something else part-time or full-time. So there's no guarantee that you will keep that love of the craft for your entire life. So you do have to work at that. But I can tell you for sure that it is possible to maintain that love of the craft for your whole life. So here's how I've done it. I have sought out, and I still try to seek out people that I really like musically and personally, and we grow together in a shared environment. We play together, and right before we came online today, I had a friend over in my garden. We played violin and guitar. He's coming over again tomorrow.
Nice.
So with this nice weather, I'm actually been playing outdoors probably 3-4 times a week. I'm actually learning more music than I have in years in these last 4 or 5 months because I haven't been able to tour. And I think a lot of musicians are using this time not only to hopefully build up our online presence a little bit, as you and I both are, to teach and create content, but also just to play and interact and study the music. So, I wouldn't say I'm a real disciplined practicer in terms of sitting there sight reading every day or using the metronome, but I love playing, and I really do like learning new tunes, and I like to compose a little. So all the things that are sort of baked into my work ethic and my routine, I've tried to magnify and intensify a little bit in the last 3 or 4 months. And I'm still looking for new people to play with. This is how I make a living on the road, actually, which hopefully I'll be able to get out and do again next year. If I see somebody online, I've forgotten how you and I met. I might have been because you left a nice comment and I replied. I think that's how we met, yes?
We actually met through Jeff Sherman.
That's maybe when I was there. That's right.
Yeah,
that's how we met.
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
But how we reconnected this time, I don't recall.
I think I made a comment on one of your videos
exactly.
that you started doing for your Sunday sessions.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So this is what I do all the time. I routinely go on to the spots where I have postings on YouTube. And if someone leaves a comment, my goal is not necessarily to turn that into a relationship that generates some money, although you've been kind enough to organize a workshop on me. We've done some lessons. Mm-hmm. My goal initially is, how are you? Thank you very much. So this could potentially lead to some work, but my goal initially is just to establish and expand my network of players, also who I am happy to help if they're traveling. So we try to help each other, sharing contacts. Maybe we're working together. Maybe one of us is taking a lesson from the other. But musicians, if you're not famous, we can create this sort of network where we encourage each other, help each other, share information, share songs, in some cases teach each other. So this is what I've been doing since I started touring with David Friesen in the late 70s. He and I did it for about 7 years. And then when we started moving in different directions musically, we sort of parted musically as friends. We're still friends, although we're not in regular touch. So my initial plan was not to be a touring musician, but I did it with him long enough But I adjusted to life on the road and I found that I liked it and I had the energy to keep it going. You know, it's not lucrative if you're not famous. So I just rent a few rooms in someone's house and I have no children, no mortgage. My expenses are pretty low when I'm not traveling. And I built up this network over 40 years of traveling all over the world of friends. So I don't make demands about plane tickets or hotel rooms. I essentially try to stitch together little tours. I'm mostly staying with the friends that I'm playing with who are booking the work in other countries or other cities because I don't know about all those local playing opportunities. And I try to reciprocate again if someone else is touring or traveling and I can help them with contacts or help connect them with my friends. So we build up this network. And if you want to be a touring musician, the benefits being playing for new audiences, making new musical friends. I've had a chance to see in about 20 countries probably, and all on a shoestring. The resume looks pretty good, but it's all very grassroots touring. It's right at the very bottom rung of the ladder in terms of a touring musician. It's mostly small venues and workshops, but I'm grateful for every single one of them. And when I show up, I sure try to do a good job and build relationships. And I've been very, very lucky in the sense that people have been very kind to me, very hospitable. And I think if you're coming into another country, there's a small you have a small advantage to being a quote American jazz musician still. Although the people who are coming in don't necessarily know who I am. You know, some guitar players know me now. I've been out there long enough, but I would hardly call myself a famous guitar player. You know, it's kind of more like a kind of an underground grassroots reputation. But I'm very grateful if anyone says they like what I'm doing. But I'm typically playing for audiences between 20 and 50 people. If I get lucky and 100 people show up, that's great. But that's not typical. But that doesn't matter to me. Again, the love of the craft and the love of playing for any audience, if it's a good audience, the size of the audience is unimportant. So that love of the craft, I've been able to kind of nurture and maintain the ups and downs, again, or canceled bookings, or someone retires from a position at a college. So then you're not able to do a workshop there anymore after 20 or 30 years of being able to. You know, the freelance world in any profession is always changing and you have to adapt to that. So it's a sales job, essentially. I'm always on the computer hunting for things. And now I'm just trying to keep my network in place so that when it is safe to resume to travel again, I'll be able to get back out there again. So, you know, for the last probably 10 or 15 years, I was out between 7 to 9 months of the year, all on a shoestring, staying with friends. It's not a life I'd recommend for most people, but I just fell into it and I still like it enough to do it. And I still have the energy, I think, to be able to teach and play well. Even if I had a long day of travel someplace, I still seem to be able to do it just fine once I get there. So this is the life I fell into. And in terms of this is a very long answer to your question, Joe, but in terms of maintaining that love of the craft and how you sort of deal with the ups and downs, it's essentially doing it in a shared environment with your friends. So that's what keeps me motivated to pick up the guitar every day, knowing I'm going to play with friends. Or if I have a solo gig or a solo performance, something coming up, you know, I create opportunities to challenge myself musically so to know that I can keep growing. If it was just me alone, I think I still play the guitar every day. If someone said, you'll never do another gig, you'll never make any more money on guitar, I probably would still pick it up every day. But I think I'm motivated to practice and learn more, knowing that I'm going to be doing either a particular project, having friends coming over, playing a gig, whatever it is. I create opportunities for myself to stay motivated and keep that love of and the love of the craft is absolutely still there, as strong as it was, or maybe more so than when I was young.
Yeah, and I think I remember you saying something about you kind of you'll create jam sessions at points to continue playing as well.
I just did one today. I've got another 2 more this week, and this is not for money. This is just playing with my friends. And I can tell you that I absolutely grow. I mean, I'm dusting off some tunes I haven't played in a while. I saw something from Yotam Silverstein, this great Israeli guitar player who does everything from Brazilian choros to transcribing Keith Jarrett to Don Bias to ethnic stuff from other countries. He's a very versatile player. And some of these folks are doing virtual collaborations. One of my favorite Brazilian guitar players, composers, vocalists is Toninho Ota. And he and Toninho were doing a song of Toninho's where they both had the headphones on playing along. Toninho singing, playing, and Yotam's playing a beautiful solo. And it's a tune that I had played years ago that I just stopped playing for some reason. I thought, I'm going to dust that off. And we played it today with my friend Eddie Parenti, the violinist. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to learn some more Toninho tunes. I hadn't played any of his tunes in years, and he's written a ton of great music. So I want to learn more. I mean, I'm a little better than some of the average American jazz musicians in the sense that I probably have maybe 20 Brazilian tunes in my repertoire. But for the most part, if you're not Brazilian, everybody plays 3 songs from Joe Beam. And they are nice tunes, for sure. But he alone wrote 400. So I think one of the ways we can grow is to continue to learn repertoire. Learning great new melodies, as I said earlier, is a way to kind of strengthen your concepts as an improviser. And it's just fun to offer fresh material to an audience. I think even if they're older tunes, if they're new to you or new to the audience, I think that's really okay. It's fine to play familiar repertoire for the audience too. My repertoire for the last 20 years probably has been more obscure music just by choice. And I'm okay with that. That's what I like to play. I mean, if someone calls Stella by Starlight at a jam session, no problem. But I'm probably not going to play that on one of my own recordings or gigs. That's just my choice.
Yeah, and that's kind of funny. That was going to be my last question for you, was your how you felt the importance of repertoire and learning.
Mm-hmm.
And you just answered a
Well,
little bit of that, but
yeah, I think that's super important. Now, bear in mind, again, this is really personal, Joe. So some musicians decide that they can really feel fulfilled by playing the same 20, 30 tunes for their whole career. And in some cases, they're quite successful, and the audience loves it because they're hearing things familiar. That particular musician thinks they can still be challenged and refined playing on those tunes, and they're right. But I would argue that another way, my approach, another way to improve is to continue to learn new music. And there's so much great music out there that nobody plays, Joe. So some of my favorite modern composers, modern meaning in the last 40, 50 years, and some of the music is played, some not so much. So obviously many people know that Wayne Shorter is an important composer, probably with dozens, if not more than 100 tunes. I have no idea how many tunes he's written, but certainly dozens.
mm-hmm.
And I play probably half a dozen of those, and I would love to learn some more Wayne. Over the years, I played more. Kenny Wheeler, I think, was an important Canadian trumpet player, flugelhorn player, who played most of his career in Europe and England. So many people think he's English, but he's Canadian. And he wrote dozens of tunes. They're beautiful, very distinctive. And I play a few of those. I want to learn some more of those. The Brazilian repertoire, there are just hundreds of fantastic Brazilian tunes. And I can play some of those. I'm going to learn some more of those. I love Steve Swallow's writing and playing, electric bassist. I play a few of his. I have many more of his. But, there are hundreds of standards that nobody plays. I mean, Stella by Starlight and all the things, fantastic. Jerome Kern's last tune, Nobody Else But Me, fantastic. It's his last tune. Soon from George Gershwin, I heard Schofield play on a record in a concert, and John's an old friend. I thought, I'm going to learn Soon. Great one. So I've got probably dozens of standards that most people don't play, or I'll play standard in a new key or a new meter. That quiz my last quiz was pretty tough. I played You Stepped Out of a Dream in 2 keys and 7/4 on a baritone fretless. And somebody did guess it. You guys all had pretty good guesses, actually, but somebody did guess it. That's probably my hardest quiz so far. But or another way to kind of expand and challenge yourself, expand your musical sensibilities and challenge yourself, is to take a familiar tune like Stella and play it in another meter or another key. So Steve Herberman and I co-taught a few lessons from Mike Eller's Mike's master classes. And Steve is, he's a bit of a detective. He likes researching some of the tunes. And Victor Young initially wrote Stella without a lyric, and it was recorded in multiple keys. Sinatra sang it in G. So Steve and I did it as a Latin 3/4 alternating B flat and G. And that was a nice challenge, actually. So I would argue that transposing or building modulations into arrangements of familiar tunes is a way to help you see relationships, and that in general helps you memorize changes, even if you're playing a tune in the original key and not concerned about a modulation. So these are all things I love to do. Play a tune in 5 or in 7, or turn it into a waltz, or try it in a new key, or create a modulation in the arrangement where you're either taking courses in different keys or splitting a tune. Probably the simplest example that most people know would be the Toots Thielemans arrangements for Bill Evans on Days of Wine and Roses, where the first half is in F, Mancini's original key, second 16 is in A flat. Mm-hmm. And that arrangement has been around long enough that when someone calls Wine and Roses on a jam session, I would say most people probably played in the one key, but I would venture probably 25 to 30 or 40% of the folks like it in the 2 keys. So I will mm-hmm. say right away, 1 key or 2. And some people are going to say, yeah, let's do the 2 key arrangement. Yeah. So these are all things that I'm still trying to do to help myself kind of grow and expand.
And what's funny about that last comment is it kind of goes back around circle. It has a lot to do with listening. If you're listening and you're aware of that and getting deep with the music, then that's something that you kind of know happens. Like, oh, that's interesting that this tune, they went into 2 keys.
Absolutely.
You can kind of take that with you.
Yeah, some modulations actually are so transparent you don't hear them. There's a great Billy Strayhorn tune that I shared with you in that PDF of the tunes called Isfahan. That's part of the Far East Suite. It's a city in Iran, trade route city. And Steve Gilmore was the bassist with Phil Woods for many years, terrific bass player. And my buddy Steve Brown in upstate New York, a guitarist who I've known for 30 years, got this arrangement from Steve Gilmore. And Billy Strayhorn liked to compose in the key of D flat.
Mm-hmm.
So Lush Life, Upper Manhattan Medical Group, Isfahan, those are all in D flat. What Steve Gilmore did is take it's a 32-bar tune. Steve Gilmore took the first 16 bars and took them down a half step to the key of C. And the modulation, I mean, you can tell with the melody when it happens during the solo, you almost don't hear the modulation, but it's clever and it's tricky. It's certainly not impossible to play, but it's a beautiful tune that I've been playing for years, and I've been playing that arrangement for years. When I did the first duo record with Dave Liebman, we did that arrangement in the 2 keys.
Nice.
And it works great. So I've got probably half a dozen tunes where I have a modulation built into the arrangement of the tune. You and I can talk about some of those another time. I think we have talked about a few of them already. Mm-hmm. But modulation is a great way to kind of internalize harmony, even if you're looking at a tune that you have no plans to create a modulation for. If you look at any set of changes, I'm looking for relationships. If it's a standard, I'm looking for the obvious things like key centers and 2-5-1s. If it's a modern tune where it's not diatonic harmony, then I'm just connecting chord shapes together and arpeggios to create melodies, but there's still relationships there, obviously. So if some Wayne Shorter songs, not a diatonic cadence in sight, but I'm still looking for relationships. What's he doing here? Where does this next chord go? And what kind of a chord quality is it? So I'll just connect things together with relationships if it's not obviously diatonic harmony.
Nice. And yeah, with the modulation thing, that's another way of just keeping things really exciting. And I know from experience, most people play Girl from Ipanema in F, and the originals in D flat.
That's right.
And I remember,
right. Why not do it in both keys?
Yeah,
that's an arrangement.
That would be pretty cool. But I remember being on a gig, and I just happened to say that, the originals in D flat, and the group was kind of like, well, let's try it out, see what happens. And when we were all done, like, that was actually so much fun to play that in that key. And it could just be, just playing it something different, because you kind of get stuck.
I agree. I agree.
We're maybe playing somewhat of the same things if you're not just playing the same licks, but you have an idea or a roadmap on how to solo over something if you play it so many times.
Absolutely. And the other option is, I agree. And the other thing we can do as guitar players is explore some open string voicings, and obviously different open strings apply in different keys. So the song can have a different feeling in terms of how it's voiced on the guitar as well, based on other keys. You and I've talked about open strings before. I love that sound.
It adds a completely different dimension to the guitar, and it's not something that a lot of jazz guitarists really use.
Yeah, and we should, I think. Now, depending on the tune and the format, if you have a couple of beats to play a chord, unless there's an open string that could be a common tone. I'm typically talking about one of the top 3 open strings, unless it's a note in the bass. So if I'm looking at a chord quality and a key, I'm just saying which one of the top 3 open strings, the G, the B, and the high E, which one of those applies. And in some cases, an open string can be very consonant. So the open E string over C major is a major third. You go up a half step, and that's a very nice C7 sharp 9. So that third becomes the sharp 9. And that's a sound that I use in a bunch of tunes by modulating down. I might keep the open E on top for a D minor 9, D flat 7 sharp 9, C major if I'm going down chromatically. So open strings can really factor in as some interesting common tones as well when you're moving through a set of changes.
Yeah. All right, John, well, we're coming to the end here. You've had a great amount of ideas that I think a ton of people are going to learn from. There's a lot of stuff that I was really excited that you said throughout this interview. I'll be happy to go back and listen to this myself.
Hey, Joe. If anyone would like to contact either one of us, you can get me on my YouTube channel, on Facebook Messenger. My website is justmyname.com. So if you want to throw some links in, I'd be very happy to hear from anybody who has watched this and would like to have a little chat. Or I would also offer to any guitar players who are interested, or musicians in general. I've got a 70-page PDF that I've shared with you of some articles I've written, charts from my original tunes. If anyone would like that, I mean, I offer this for lessons. Of course, I'm happy to send anybody for a lesson, but I happily send out the PDFs for free. I do it all the time. It takes 1 minute. I'm really happy to share the information. So anyone can reach out to me. I'm happy to hear from anybody.
Yeah, and down in the description box, I will have a link to John's website, his email address. I will also include his 3 TrueFile courses and some of the Mike's Masterclass stuff, and as well as the DC music stuff. That'll all be there for you guys to check that out and get to hear a little bit more of John's playing.
Yeah, that's all up on my YouTube channel too. So any of those places, people can find me. I'm very happy to hear from anybody if you want to check in and say hello.
Nice. Well, John, to end things, would you like to play a tune for us?
I will play a tune for y'all. Why not? This is my handy Soloette designed by my buddy Roscoe Wright. And a friend made a little cloth covering. These are just, you know this guitar already, Joe, but maybe some of the folks are watching. I'm going to adjust the angle a little bit so they can see the guitar a bit better. So this guitar comes apart, this part of the instrument. These are plastic tubes that are encased in fabric, and this part comes off. So the guitar goes in the case. I think I've had this guitar when you and I have been down in Louisville together. Goes in a case like a fishing rod case. So it is very portable and easy for travel. It comes apart. It has a graphite neck. Pickup system is a DiMarzio Andy Timmons, which even though it's a very hot humbucker, has a very nice clean sound. And I also have piezo. This is RMC. I'm primarily using the neck position pickup, but the piezo gives you a bit of articulation too. So this guitar has thankfully been my traveling companion for now maybe 12, 13 years. And even the little commuter jets, it just goes right up there in that little tiny overhead where the briefcase is. So this has made my life. I have normal guitars, which I also like. But this guitar is one of my guitars of choice for sure, even if I'm not flying. And I'm very grateful to Roscoe I have a nylon version of this one too that I think I've showed you. It's also headless. So it has conventional tuners down here. And then the top of the neck, you just thread the string through a little hole and kind of string it up in reverse. Very clever design. And Roscoe made this design for about 20 years. Very nice man. We're still in touch. He's also in Oregon. And grateful to have this guitar. So, well, let's see. What will I do for you all? Oh, maybe I'll do something from Brazil since we talked about that. So I should keep this on the short side to kind of finish up the maybe just a melody, or how much time would you like me to play for, Joe? I was thinking like three-ish minutes.
Yeah, about 3 minutes if you want to play the melody and take a few choruses.
You bet. Here's one I like from Tom Jobim that I did recently on my YouTube channel, and he wrote it in 4, but I was going back and forth between Latin 3 and a Latin 4, so I'll do a bit of that. It's called Inutil Paisatiam. It's in the real book as If You Never Come to Me. Here's a little inutile passage for you, Joe.
That was beautiful, John. Thanks.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for being on the show. It was great. Again, you had
my pleasure.
A ton of great information for everybody, including myself. And
my pleasure, Joe.
Please keep up with John. Like I said, his YouTube channel will be available in the description box. He's been doing, as he mentioned in the video on Sunday, he's been doing a session where he presents a new tune. And then I think the week after that, you're kind of doing a breakdown on that. Is that right?
Yeah, we're doing, my buddy Sebastian Klausman is a great younger guitarist in Germany that I'm working with. He's helping me with all the social media. So his idea, and this is the format we've been using now for a few months, do a chord melody with the solo, kind of like what I just did for you. And then the next week, kind of break down the harmonic information. So that I'm talking about the voicings and where I come up with it. And then the third week generally is a quiz where I play something without the melody and then invite people to log on with a guess. And the first 5 people who get it get a free lesson. So that's been our format. Seems to work pretty well. We're going to keep doing that.
Yeah. That's how we got back in touch, really.
And I'm happy about that.
Yeah, it's been great. All right, John, again, I appreciate you being on the show. It was great. And I'd love to have you again in the future. And everybody stay safe out there.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Joe. I'd love to do another one in the future too. Stay well.
See ya.